how much can really central bank tightening around the world, especially in the emerging market economies, help offset some of that dollar strength coming from the U.S. tightening?
I think basically if we're looking at across of EM Asia clearly is much better positioned in terms of other parts of emerging markets. In terms of tightening, I think there is room for emerging markets to basically lag a bit behind. So I think at this point in time, even if we see a stronger dollar, central banks are probably a bit more comfortable with the fact that their currencies are not going to be as strong as before. That potentially can be positive in terms of how they see their exports, especially for those big export-oriented economies. Probably one big difference there would be the CNY, given that from that perspective, what we're seeing is the CNY currency is actually strengthening against the dollar. And that, to a certain extent, does help provide some offset to dollar strength for dollar Asian currencies as well.
The Chinese yuan, as this GTV chart on the Bloomberg shows, at a 6-year high against the US dollar. So we are seeing now signs that the PBoC may consider easing a little bit. Will this have an impact on the yuan?
Well, I mean, if we look at the Q3 monetary policy report that came out Friday, they did mention that they wanted to do a bit more in terms of window guidance for the currency. But to me, it really sounds like they're just trying to warn about the risks of the currency becoming too one-sided. If we look at where the CNY is right now in time, clearly, yes, the trade-weighted value is very high. But if we look at the gap between the CNY and the CNH, it's not excessively big. So that suggests, in my view, the market is not really one-sided. What I would be really watching the daily CNY fixings. So usually if the CNY does become too one-sided, what the PBoC does like to do is they will start implementing that counter-cyclical factor in the fixing. What we are seeing right now is they're not really doing that yet. So that, in my mind, really suggests that they're still relatively comfortable, but they're kind of hedging their bets in a way and just trying to warn markets, yes, the CNY is strong, but don't get it too ahead of yourselves. Basically, in our view, we think the CNY index stays elevated given the stronger dollar. The key for that really is that will then ensure that dollar CNY stays relatively flat, relatively stable. And that, again, does provide that anchor for Asian currencies just here.
You sound like you're describing this as, you know, a very successful effort at both communication and also guidance for market expectations, right? Is that why we're seeing markets feel pretty sanguine about the yuan at the moment?
Well, I think there's also the other factor that if we really look at the performance of the yuan, it has really stood out this year, right? So we were talking about the CNY index at a very high level. On a year-to-date basis, the yuan is the strongest currency in Asia. So if we look at the mind of the investors, yes, to a certain extent, there are fundamental reasons why the CNY should be so strong. For example, the basic balance is quite high. If we look at the carry and volatility, the CNY has the best characteristics of that within Asia. So there are definitely fundamental reasons supporting the CNY. But I would believe that if we look at a lot of investors, we talk to a lot of investors as well, what they are saying is, well, dollar China here at 6.4, basically a bit below 6.4, it does for them, they're also a bit wary. So also just given that we are seeing the PBoC speaking up now, I think that in their minds is another signal that they're really quite cautious in terms of just making sure they don't become too overweight the CNY just here.
If we see a more aggressive effort to rein in not-so-transitory inflation by the Fed, now that there is the continuity expected from Jay Powell, what are the bit of beneficiaries and what are the currencies at risk in emerging Asia?
Well, I mean, I think right now what we're seeing is, yes, like you said, after the Powell renomination yesterday, the dollar is strengthening. Market expectations of inflation are edging a bit lower. If we look at the break-evens, nominal yields are a bit higher. So what really should happen is real yields are heading higher, the dollar higher. So for us in dollar Asia, I think it really depends. So firstly, what I'll be watching as well, are you an economy which is really tied to global growth? If the Fed is hiking in a global growth scenario, then I think the North Asian currencies still have potential to do better. So the likes of Taiwan, Korea, I think they still have a lot of potential to offset that dollar rate hike. in an environment where it's just a hawkish Fed really hiking, I think there is certainly still some value in other parts of ASEAN. So, for example, the Sing dollar also stands to benefit to a certain extent. Some of the high yielders, of course, will probably stand to lose. But what I would highlight that if we look at a lot of ASEAN currency performance this year, ASEAN has really underperformed, though. So I think just now in the current environment, there may be a little scope for ASEAN to catch up a bit.